My name is Coleman Jacobson. I'm 79 years old now, but when I was born in 1921 in New Haven, Connecticut, we got a good start in life. That was a good place to be born and a good time to be born. I was the last of 7 children. My oldest sister is 95 and she still lives in Dallas, and I'm 79 and I'm the youngest, and all 5 in between have passed away. Many of them also were in the service. We grew up in a nice home, lower middle class home. I don't think Papa ever made $75 a week, but he was an industrious guy. He made fur coats for ladies, and he was very good. And he worked for a number of different people. All of them liked him very much, and he was a very good provider, and he loved kids. Never remember Daddy having a bad word for anybody. He always was very pleasant and lovable. Mama was a little bit different. She was a little bit more strict, and she had most of the responsibilities of running a big household with very little. But we never needed anything. As I said, we were poor, but we didn't know it. I went to a nice school in a nice neighborhood. We always walked to school. It was, retrospectively, kids today wouldn't want to walk that far to school. But we walked, and it was a pleasant walk, and we'd come home for lunch, too. It was very nice. And I finished school. I was a reasonably good student in school, went on to high school. High school was a lovely place, and I started high school about 1935. The Depression was roaring in those days, and I went to high school in New Haven, Connecticut. It was called New Haven High School, and the teachers were superb there. I remember in my senior year in high school, I took 5 subjects. 4 of my teachers had PhDs. And they were making $100 a month, which was good money in those days, so they really towed the bark well, and they were devoted to their efforts and did a very good job. After I graduated high school, I went off to university. I was the first one in the Depression area in the family that went to university. One of my older brothers, who graduated high school back in 1925, he went to university because they could afford it in those days. But in between time, I had a very bright brother who never was able to go to college because there was no money to send him to college in those days. In any event, I went to a state college. I went to the University of Connecticut, which was a nice small school in northeastern Connecticut. Started out as an agricultural college, as so many of them did, but it was nice, but somehow or other I didn't like it there too much. And after 2 years, I quit, and I hitchhiked down to Florida in the wintertime. I quit after the first semester there, and hitchhiked down to Florida around Christmas time and got a job as a busboy in one of those hotels in what is now South Beach. It was a fancy place in those days, and I worked a pretty good deal. We would start out about 6 o'clock in the morning and get the dining room set up for breakfast and serve breakfast, but it was a unique job because after breakfast was served, we didn't have to do anything until 5:30 or 6 o'clock when we served dinner, because they didn't serve lunch there. So I had that whole middle part of the day to go on to the beach, or to learn how to bet on horses and go to the racetrack, or to do all sorts of interesting things. There were a lot of nice people down there in the summertime. You had a good conversation with a large cross-section of people from all over the country, and you learned a lot. You kept your ears open and your mouth shut, and you listened to people, and you learned a lot of things that you didn't learn in Connecticut in the 30s. Well, after being there for about a month, my older brother, who was a pretty good businessman, came down for a vacation. They didn't know that I was there, and I didn't know that they were coming, and it was just accidentally, coincidentally, that he and his wife stopped at the same hotel. And he was surprised to see me, and not too pleased, I don't think, either, but his wife really got after me, and she wanted to know, why in God's good name did you ever quit college and come down here and working like this? You got to think of your future. What are you going to do? You make something of yourself. And she bugged me so much and wrote away for catalogs for other schools. I said, well, I'll go back to school, but I want to go to the Midwest. I always liked the Midwest. So we got some catalogs from Iowa and Illinois and Michigan, and finally decided to go to the University of Iowa. And I belonged to a fraternity in Connecticut, and they had a chapter in Iowa, so I wrote to them, and they were very nice to me. And in those days, people didn't move around so much. So when these guys in Iowa got a letter from a guy in Connecticut saying that he was coming out there, would like to live at the fraternity house, they welcomed me with open arms. I remember when I got off the Rock Island Railroad train in Iowa City, there were 5 of them at the station to meet me. You know, they didn't know me at all. And they took me in. They were very, very nice to me. In the Midwest, people were a little bit more well-to-do than we were back east in those days. They all came from Iowa. The folks had good jobs and so forth, and they lived pretty well. And they were happy to see me because I had a few talents that they could use. I've been used to working in restaurants, so I knew how to run a kitchen and run food service and so forth. So they made me the steward, took care of all the meals and planned them with the cook and everything, and hired the cook. And they paid me, I think I got $100 a month, and I got room, and then I was a waiter, and I got my board. So here I was going to college like a king. I had a little money in my pocket, and I had good opportunities to do whatever I wanted to, so it was very pleasant, and I did well there in college. Everybody was very nice to me, and I still have many friends from those days in Iowa. Well, I wanted to be a doctor, and I was a pre-medical student, and went along very well until Pearl Harbor came, and I was a senior that year when Pearl Harbor came, so a number of us went down the next day, and Monday, and we enlisted in the Air Corps, wanted to be a flyer. And they didn't call us up until about April of 1942. I got my degree, they gave me my degree, and April of 42 they called me up, and they sent me to Moorhead State Teachers College, right out opposite from Fargo, North Dakota. They didn't know where to send us in those days, and we stayed there for a few months. I learned how to fly a little airplane over in the Fargo airport. People were very nice to us there because there weren't many soldiers around, but after being there and they got themselves organized, they sent us to Santa Ana, California, and that was where we went into all of our indoctrinations and with all the examinations and everything. And I didn't qualify for a pilot, so they sent me to bombardier school and navigator school, and I wound up in initially in Albuquerque, New Mexico. In those days, in 1942, Albuquerque, New Mexico was a small town of about 25,000 people, and there was a big air base there called Kirtland Field, and that was the place where we learned how to be bombardiers, and we learned some navigation there too. And after finishing the program there, they sent us to a place in Arizona. We went to Tucson, Arizona, to Davis-Monthan Field. I think that's still a big field there. And at Davis-Monthan, we organized a crew. They forget what they called that, but they had everybody together. They had the navigator, bombardier, pilot, and co-pilot, and the gunners, and the radio man, and the mechanics. And we all met each other, came from all different parts of the country, and formed a nice crew together, and we went into what they call transitional training, and we learned how to operate together, and we did these various and sundry missions, and had a good training program for quite a few months until we were operating very well in a coordinated fashion as a team. And it was interesting meeting different people. Some of the kids on the crew were only 17 or 18. I remember one of them, he came from the south someplace and was pretty unsophisticated, and I used to tell him various and sundry moral things and so forth. He later became a preacher, and I still keep in touch with him. He lives in Ocala, Florida now, and comes to visit me occasionally. And I still keep in touch with a few of the guys that were on the crew. Well, after we finished our training, the government felt that they ought to get something out of us, so they decided to send us overseas for combat duty. And the first thing they did, they cut orders for us to go to Topeka, Kansas. I forget how we got there. I think we got a little bit of a leave, and I remember there was some problem, kind of an interesting thing. I had a girlfriend up in Iowa City, and I went up to Iowa City to see her. We were supposed to drive back. Someone was supposed to meet us in St. Louis or something, but it got fouled up, and I had to take a commercial airplane. First time I ever was in a commercial airplane, and had to get back to Tucson, I guess, yeah. And so I got to Dallas, Texas, somehow or other, I don't remember, but I was waiting for this flight on a DC-3 from Dallas to Tucson, and finally made the flight, and was worried every time it stopped that they were going to throw me off and I'd be late for duty and get into trouble, but it wasn't, and it was the first commercial flight I'd ever been on. I think there were 21 seats, and that was in 1943, I guess it was. Anyhow, after we organized ourselves and flew together as a group to Topeka, Kansas, they gave us a brand new B-24 right off the assembly line, and we flew it to a base in New Hampshire where they put all kinds of gear on board. I remember we each got a pistol and a lot of other stuff that they needed over there, and then we flew it from New Hampshire to Ireland. Made a few stops. We stopped one night in Newfoundland and one night in Iceland, and I think we got weathered in Iceland, spent about 3 days in Iceland, but we finally got to Ireland. And when we got to Ireland, you know what they did? They took away that nice brand new airplane from us, and they sent us by boat over to England and then by train to this base in Wendling, England, where we were a replacement crew. We were in the 392nd Bomb Group, the 459th Bomb Squadron, and our group replaced somebody that had been shot down sometime before. And after a short period of time, a week or 10 days, we began to fly missions, and this was about in July. It was shortly after D-Day. We'd already had a fairly good foothold in France, and things were going pretty good with the war. And we were scheduled to fly all of these missions out of Wendling, England, which was a base in the middle of nowhere. They just carved a landing strip, and they had a lot of Quonset huts there. Being a replacement crew, you didn't get to have the feel of belonging too well, and but by the time a couple of months had gone by, and we'd flown our first mission, and that was successful, and then a second and third. By the time we'd flown 5 or 6 missions, we'd gotten pretty cocky and pretty used to things, and we hadn't been banged up too much at that point. But then came the fateful day in September 11th, 1944. We were having a mission to Hanover, Germany, and we got hit going into the target by a lot of flak, and we lost an engine on one side, and then we got hit by some fighter planes and lost another engine on the same side, but we were able to drop our bombs okay, and we hit our target okay, and then we were just a short distance away from the city when we began to develop some fire in the bomb bay, and 2 engines off. We were losing altitude. We'd lost the rest of the group by then, and it looked as though we were going down, so we got orders to get out of there. And everybody got out of the airplane. I forget how I got out. I think I kind of walked from the nose where the bombardier and the gunner was down to the catwalk and went out to the bomb bay. The bombs had already gone out, so there was a big hole there, lots of sunlight. So we went through, didn't think much about it at the time. I don't remember being scared or anything, but we just did what we were trained to do, and we had pretty good training, and we did what we were supposed to do. I took my pistol with me, but I thought after I was coming down that was a kind of a bad idea, because I was going to hit not far from the city, and I knew I wouldn't have much of a chance of getting out, and if I had a pistol in me and some civilians picked me up, they would be liable to shoot me. So I dismantled the pistol on the way down. And since I was Jewish and I knew that the Nazis were very mean to the Jews there, I got rid of my dog tags too. I forgot exactly where I hid them, but I hid them someplace so that they wouldn't know that I was Jewish, because that was on the dog tags. But it was a smart thing that I did, because while I landed outside of the city, I was picked up by a bunch of angry civilians, and they beat me up pretty good, and yelling and screaming in German, because it wasn't too far away from where our bombs had gone off 20, 30 minutes before. But in any event, they finally picked us up, and some policemen came out and got us, or got me anyhow. We didn't see the other people, but by this time, it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and they took us to a police station, and then they took us to the railroad station. By that time, it was night, and I remember distinctly, it was a terrible, terrible experience, because by that time, they'd captured a few other of our crew and a few other people. There was evidently quite a few guys been knocked down. And we were in the bottom of the railroad station, which is served as sort of an air raid shelter. By this time, it was about midnight, and the British were coming over at night, and they were dropping bombs, and it was scary. And everybody was glowering at us. We were a bunch of maybe 12 or 14 prisoners. And the night went on and on. It was kind of hellacious before all of the bombing stopped. We were on the receiving end this time instead of on the giving end. But ultimately, that all stopped, and they put us on a train, which I don't have too much recollection, but they took us to a place near Frankfurt, Germany. It was called Oberursel. It was an interrogation camp, and they stuck me in a room. Remember, we got off the train at the train station, and then they took us in a trolley car. We went in a trolley car up to the interrogation center, and I was in this solitary room, and they let me out to go to the bathroom, and I see this one guy who later turned out to be Mozart Kaufman, who was in our group. He looked terrible. He was all bewhiskered and bedraggled, and his hair was all disheveled. I thought, oh my God, they're really beating him up in here. I found out later that Mozart had been captured in France, and they were transporting him by truck and the one type of a vehicle after another, and he hadn't had anything to wash with or not much to eat over a period of a couple of weeks. That was the reason he looked so bad. But they interrogated us. I guess they had, by that time, plenty of information, so I don't remember the interrogation very much. We gave them our name, rank, and serial number, and they didn't bother us much anyhow. And then finally, after a week or 10 days, I don't remember the exact time, it's solitary confinement there all the time, and they'd give you something to eat. It wasn't very much, but it was okay. And then they put us on a train to take us to the prison camp where we were, and this was in Barth, up in the northern part of Germany, between Rostock and Stettin, a little town called Barth, which was sort of a resorty type of place on the Baltic Sea. And they marched us off the train into the prison camp, and it was a big prison camp. They'd had a lot of people there. We found out that it had been there since 1939, and they had British flyers who'd been there since that time, were shot down right after the beginning of the war. So from 1939 until 1942, it was just a British prison camp, and the British sort of ran it. They administered it. Evidently, the German military was so organized that a given service took care of their own prisoners. So we were prisoners of the Luftwaffe, and the Luftwaffe ran the camp. It wasn't a concentration camp, it was just a Luftwaffe prisoner camp, and it wasn't too bad the way they treated us there. But they'd gotten so many POWs in this period of time prior to our arrival that they had to keep building new compounds. So this camp was organized. They had what they called the South Compound, which was the old original one that had a little medical facility, library facility. It was a pretty good situation, but then they just kept building these other compounds without having any connection between them, so you couldn't go from one to the other except under special circumstances. So they built a compound they called North 1, and by the time we got there, that was full. There were roughly about 2,500, 3,000 prisoners in each one of these compounds. And we were in North 2, and people were coming in fairly fast then. I think the day that we arrived, there were probably about 115 or 120 arrived. And we were assigned to a certain barracks, and you got to know the guys that you were living with. There were probably around 20 or 24 of us in triple-decker bunks in those rooms. If any of you have ever seen the movie production or TV production Stalag 17, I think the guy who designed those sets was in our prison camp because they were absolutely genuine, just the way we lived. And we had a little stove in there, and the food situation was such that each room was a dining area in itself, if you want to call it that, a mess area. And we were allotted one loaf of black bread a day for 7 people, and then a certain number of vegetables, rutabagas, and rutabagas are a big vegetable that we never had seen very much of in the States, sort of like a squash, only harder texture like a potato. And then we had potatoes. We didn't get many green vegetables, and we rarely got any meat, but we did get parcels from the Red Cross. And we did get something at the interrogation center. They gave us a little satchel from the American Red Cross or the YMCA, and it had nice stuff in it. It had a sweaters and some food and some little books that you could write in and one thing or another. And that was what we put all of our gear in, and I think everybody in the prison camp had one of those, which was very nice. And the Red Cross parcels were great because they were very intelligently put together. They had a can of Klim, which is milk spelled backwards, and they had some fish and some meat, and they had cigarettes and chocolate. Cigarettes were a big deal. You could trade cigarettes for food. Everybody was smoking in those days, in contradistinction to today. And we got used to prison life after a while. We didn't have a lot to do. We did have some books to read, and we organized ourselves in such a fashion that we would have some educational programs or some entertainment programs. Guys that could do things would go from one barracks to another and put on little shows and do a little studying and have some classes. And there was evidently some escape programs going on. The wheels, the guys that were majors and colonels, were kind of running the camp. We had a top guy by the name of Colonel Spicer. He was something. He had his big walrus mustache, and Colonel Spicer was spit and polish. He must have been a West Pointer, and he used to give the Germans a hard time. And I remember one day at roll call, we'd have roll call twice a day there. He got up there and he told us that it was our job to escape from here, it was our job not to cooperate with the Germans, not to speak to them. Oh, he went on and on and on. And the German officers got a little bit teed off at poor old Colonel Spicer. They put him in what they called a cooler. That was the solitary confinement. I think he was in and out of there quite a while, but I think he was in the cooler when the Germans finally left. I don't remember that detail, but everybody had great respect for Colonel Spicer, and he went on after the war to have a wonderful military career. Well, life got a bit boring in the prison camp. I was only there about 10 months, but the routine was about the same. We would periodically get some news about the Russians coming. We were in the Russian zone. We were close to the Oder River, and we could get some BBC information. See, Americans were pretty ingenious. They had things organized. We even had our own radio. As a matter of fact, I was considered one of what they call a trader, T-R-A-D-E-R. I could talk to and trade with the Germans because I spoke some German. So if we needed a battery for the radio or some tubes or whatever kind of stuff that we needed, we could trade with them for cigarettes or chocolate. And they had it organized in such a fashion that most of the guys were not allowed or weren't supposed to be talking to the German guards. We used to call the Germans goons. I remember one day, one of them who spoke some English, he'd probably studied English in school, he came to me with his dictionary. He says, "What is this goon? I don't find this goon in the dictionary." And I said, "Oh, that's a special word meaning a lovely, nice fellow." And he was happy about that, but we knew what goons meant. Well, life went on, and then towards the end of the war, we were getting pretty good information that the Russians were approaching here, and the war was kind of winding down. Of course, we who were shot down after D-Day knew that the war couldn't last too long. We were mopping up all over. But we would get out and yell, "Uncle Joe, come on, Uncle Joe," at nighttime when all of the things was locked up, and the Germans would get mad as hell at all of us yelling that way. But there was not much they could do about it. And ultimately, one day we woke up on it was the 1st of May, 1945, and there were no Germans to be seen. They'd all taken off their uniforms, put on civilian clothes, and disappeared into the civilian population. Well, since I spoke German and I was trading with them, I hot-tailed it into town. I picked up a couple of cameras and a whole bunch of film. And then I stopped they had a flax school near there, and you know how Americans are, we wanted souvenirs. I picked up old German hats and white coats for wintertime and daggers and a whole bunch of stuff, and brought it back to the camp and gave all of those things to our comrades there. And then I began taking pictures. I must have taken 300 pictures, which I still have, and I brought some of them here today. Everybody's been looking at them. And it was hellacious time. Everybody was going wild. Colonel Zemke wanted to keep everything under control, so he issued orders that nobody was to leave the camp or they would be court-martialed afterwards, and they were trying to negotiate to have somebody come and pick us up, and they were having some trouble with the Russians, I guess, negotiating. But in the meantime, after 2 or 3 days, a Russian contingency came into the camp, and the Russian colonel was riding a horse, as I remember, and he was drunk, and he was brandishing a pistol in front of Colonel Zemke and saying to the effect, I remember Walter Boychuk was one of our buddies there who could speak a little Russian, and he told Colonel Zemke that this Russian was saying, "Aren't you guys happy that we liberated you? Why aren't you out in town raping the women, burning the buildings, breaking the windows, and why don't you show some appreciation for being liberated?" Well, Zemke was probably afraid that they were going to shoot him, so he told the boys, "Okay, fellas, wreck the joint." Well, you know how that was. They broke all the windows and this and that and the other thing, and then they had to sleep with the cold wind coming in. But in the meantime, there was a lot of rambunctiousness going on. I remember a bunch of the guys from Texas rounded up some cattle, and they butchered a couple of steers, and they were frying steaks, without any tenderizing or anything. And there was just pandemonium was breaking loose there. And by that time, a few of the fellas had left. Well, I guess it was about the 4th or the 5th, this one Russian came up here. He was what they call a dolmetsch, or a translator, because most of the troops were from the steeps of the Ural Mountains. They were Mongols. They had slanty eyes and this patchwork uniforms. They'd put a loaf of bread in one pocket and a sausage in the other, and they could go fight for a whole week without any supply. Their army wasn't organized the way ours was. But anyhow, I got friendly with this guy. He spoke every language except English. But I got to him in German, and I told him I wanted a car. I wanted to get out of there with a buddy of mine. And could he get me a car and some money? And he wrote me a little note in German, which I still have in my scrapbook, that he said he would bring the car over the next day. I guess it was the 5th or the 6th or something. And the two of us set out with the car, and he says, money's no good. He says, I'll give you this instead. And he gave me 2 pillowcases. One of them was full of pistols, not full, about 6 or 8 pistols, and the other one had cameras in it. And he said, you could trade these for anything you want because they're a valuable trading item. So we set out. We didn't go more than about 60 miles, and it was about 100 miles to the British lines. But we ran out of gas, and then we got a couple of horses, but that didn't work too well. We stayed overnight in a German lady's house. She had 2 young daughters. She was afraid for her daughters, was glad the Americans were there, not the Russians. But the next day we got some bicycles, and ultimately, I can't remember the details, but ultimately we made the British lines, and I gave them a cock and bull story that we were escaped prisoners of war, and we had secret information that had to get to the headquarters in Paris very quickly. Well, would you know, those guys flew us to a Paris airport, military airport, and we landed there, and we went in the orderly room. I can't remember the details of it, but I remember I had a friend who was in the medical administrative corps, was a major, and there was a directory there. Imagine this coincidence. I flipped the directory to his name, and there was his name with his telephone number, and I rang the number, and would you imagine that? He answered the telephone himself. And I told him my situation. I'd seen him in 2 years. I told him my situation, and he said, well, lock yourself in the latrine there and don't talk to anybody, and it'll take me 3 or 4 hours to get out there. Well, this other guy, he didn't want to wait, so he took off, and I didn't see him for about a week. I did finally bump into him in Paris, but my friend did come out in a staff car, and he was a major, and he was a big shot, and he wanted me to know that he was a big shot. He could speak French very well, too. So he took me into town and took me to a hotel, and he spoke to the concierge, and he told the concierge that I was to be given a suite of rooms. Well, a suite. There was a living room and a bedroom. And he was to translate these pistols and cameras into francs and not to treat me. And this was marvelous. So the next day, he took me out to Longchamp's racetrack with a couple of his buddies, and I have pictures of that in my album. We took pictures that day because I had the camera. And it was marvelous, and he took me to the PX, got me brand new clean uniforms. I think he sent a wire home to my folks that I was okay. And he got me a card that I could eat at the casual officers' mess. It was marvelous. And then he got tired of showing off to me, so he left me on my own. Well, I met this other guy that was with me, and we'd gotten into our cups a little bit and raucous a little bit there in Paris, running around. And then, of course, VE Day came. We were there. It was May 8th. It was a hellacious evening, as you could imagine. The war was over and anything goes. And, well, to make a long story short, a couple of days later, I got sick. I don't remember exactly what I had, but I had a high fever. I only weighed about 122 pounds when I got out of the prison camp after being about 175, 180. So you can imagine how emaciated we were. And the reason was after the Battle of the Bulge, we didn't get any more, that was in December of '44, we didn't get any more Red Cross parcels, and our food supply was pretty meager, and we just lost a lot of weight. And we put it on pretty quickly, but here we were in Paris with a fever of 103 or 4. So I was upset, and I called my friend. I said, Bill, what am I going to do? I'm sick. He said, well, take the subway over to such and such a station, and there's a station hospital there, Army Station Hospital. Just talk to the officer today and tell him you're a casual here in Paris and you're sick. And I did that. And they put me in bed. And they came around, they took a history, gave me they wanted to know where I was shot down and what kind of injuries I had and all of this sort of stuff. And you know how the Army was, they had recorded everything. and the doctors came around and examined me, and they gave me medication, put me in bed. Well, after about 5 days, one morning, an honor guard came at the foot of the bed, and someone read out the orders that Lieutenant Jacobson, wounded in action in such and such a place and so forth, was hereby awarded the Purple Heart. They didn't give me the Purple Heart itself. They gave me a little pin, and they gave me these orders. I thought, my God, this is quite a place. Well, anyhow, by the time I got better, they discharged me right back out to the street. Can you imagine that? No record or anything. But then I went into the hotel that I was there. I still had my stuff there. And I reported to the sane section headquarters and told them I was an escaped prisoner of war. And they said, oh, we'll send you home right away. So they sent me to this Camp Lucky Strike that had a lot of these prisoners that were in transit to go home. They offered me a flight home, but I told them I'd go home by ship. And I don't remember how long I was there, but I guess I got home probably around the second week in June. So I got to Paris on the 6th or 7th of May, and I left there around the beginning of June, and I think I got home around June 15th or so.
Say they'll give you about 5 minutes. They want you to go on a tour. Or I mean, they're going someplace and they want you along in 5 minutes.
You want me to finish later?
Yeah, well, no, finish right now.
Okay.
Finish up in 5 minutes.
I'll finish in 5 minutes, yeah.
Okay.
Well, after, let me see, where was I? Oh, yeah, I got home. Oh, yes, this is an interesting part of the story. Is I got home on the 15th of June. They gave me a 50 or 60-day leave, and then I wound up in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and one morning someone said, Jacobson, your name is on the bulletin board for immediate discharge. I thought he was pulling my leg, but sure enough it was. And I wanted to go back to medical school, so I got out of the Army, and here it was, the 11th of September. Medical school was starting in many places, so I called up the dean at Iowa Medical School, where I'd gotten my degree, and I told him my sad story. So he said, I'll check your record in the registrar's office, and I'll call you back. He called me back. He said, well, you got a good record, and we owe you something. Classes start on the 19th. Come on out, which I did. All I had was my uniform. I had a lot of money because I had all that pay. So I got there and started medical school on the 19th. I was married. My wife came with me. We got an apartment. It was tough getting back to school after being away for 4 years, but between September and Christmas, I got into the swing of things and did pretty good in medical school over the next few years. So the guys that were there in my class were mostly young kids that were right out of high school. The Army had taken them in their ASTP program or the Navy in their V-12 program. And they were all about 4 years younger, 4 or 5 years younger than me. And I was an officer, and they were all privates, and they looked at me with amazement, and I looked at them with fear and trepidation because they knew how to study and I didn't. Anyhow, we got along pretty good after a while, and after 4 years in medical school, of course, the war kind of drifted out of your thing. You got to look out for the future, and we finished medical school, went to Philadelphia, did an internship and a residency there, and then came out to Texas to practice, and that's what we did from that on, and that's the end of the sad story. So here you are, down here in Wyoming for a reunion of all of the buddies, and I brought a lot of the pictures that I took in the prison camp there to show them. We're having a wonderful time together here. And we thank Mr. Lian for putting this all together, because it's been a wonderful affair for everybody concerned.
If you don't hurry up, you won't.
The chestnut trees, the wishing well, I'll be seeing you in every lovely summer's day, in everything that's light and gay. I'll always think of you that way. I'll find you in the morning sun, and when the night is new, I'll be looking at the moon, but I'll be